They threw me out like trash on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day where nothing dramatic is supposed to happen. I remember the sound of the door more than their voices, the dull thud as it closed behind me, final and impatient. My sister stood in the hallway with her arms crossed, already scrolling her phone, while my uncle avoided my eyes like looking at me might make the situation contagious. I had a single backpack on my shoulder and a box of papers in my hands, things they decided were mine and nothing more. That was the moment they thought they won. For years, I had been the extra piece in that family, useful only when something needed fixing. I handled paperwork, organized accounts, smoothed over arguments with vendors, and stayed quiet during meetings where my name was never written on the board. They called it helping. I called it survival. Every time I asked about my place, about security, about why everything was always in someone else's name, they smiled and told me to be patient. Family takes care of family, they said, while locking doors I didn't even know existed. The irony is that I never planned to own everything. I planned to protect it. When my father started the company, he trusted me with the boring parts, the parts no one wanted to touch. Contracts, registrations, renewals, compliance letters that arrived in thick envelopes and smelled like ink and dust. I learned early that power rarely looks impressive. It hides in margins, footnotes, signatures made years before anyone thought to question them. While they fought over titles and offices, I read every line. By the time my father fell ill, the house had already shifted. Decisions were being made in rushed conversations and late-night calls I wasn't invited to, but the work still landed on my desk. "You're good with details," they said, pushing folders toward me without looking up. What they didn't notice was that every task added another thread connecting back to me. Licenses renewed in my name because I was available. Emergency filings signed by me because I was present. Temporary solutions that became permanent simply because no one bothered to undo them. When my father died, grief turned into appetite. Suddenly everyone wanted something concrete, something they could point to and claim as proof they mattered. The house, the cars, the visible assets became weapons. I was told to wait again, to let things settle, to trust the process. I did what I had always done. I waited, I watched, and I kept records. So when they told me I had to leave, when they framed it as a necessary step for the good of the family, I understood something they didn't. They believed ownership was about possession, about who slept where and who sat at the head of the table. They thought kicking me out erased me from the picture. Standing there with my box and my backpack, I realized how wrong they were. That night, alone in a cheap motel room that smelled like bleach and old carpet, I spread my papers across the bed. Receipts, certificates, digital keys printed and tucked into folders, emails confirming approvals no one else remembered requesting. Each document was a quiet sentence in a story they never bothered to read. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm, the kind of calm that comes when a puzzle finally makes sense. They had thrown me out believing they had stripped me of leverage. What they actually did was remove the last reason for me to stay silent. Lying there, listening to cars pass on the highway, I understood the scale of their mistake. They thought they owned everything that mattered. They never realized that on paper, in ink and law and time, everything was already mine. I thought about calling friends, about explaining myself, but I knew explanations would only weaken what I was about to do. Instead, I slept for 3 hours, woke before dawn, and opened my laptop with the same patience I used to give their demands. I logged into systems they forgot existed, checked statuses they assumed were handled, and confirmed what instinct had already told me. Ownership isn't declared in shouting matches. It's defined by quiet consistency over time. By the time the sun rose, I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. Focused on letting them believe their version of the story a little longer, because the truth, when it arrived, would hit harder without warning. Being thrown out wasn't the end. It was the moment everything finally became clear. I didn't rush revenge or speeches, trusting that patience and paper trails would do what emotion never could, turning their certainty into confusion at exactly the right moment later. The next morning, I didn't call them. and that silence did something interesting. It made them loud. My phone filled with messages that pretended to be concerned while dripping with relief, like they expected me to beg. "Let us know when you calm down," my sister wrote, as if being expelled from your own home was a tantrum. My uncle sent a longer note about boundaries and respect, words people use when they've crossed both. I read everything once, then archived it, because responding would have told them I still needed their permission to exist. I didn't. Instead, I drove to the office building they loved to parade in front of investors. Security waved me through without hesitation. My badge still worked. It always had. I took the elevator up alone, the hum steady and familiar, and stepped onto a floor that suddenly felt like a stage waiting for an actor who had memorized the entire script while everyone else skimmed the program. I sat at the desk they had never bothered to reassign and logged in. Everything opened like it always did, quietly, obediently, as if nothing had changed at all. They underestimated routine. People think control comes from force, but it really comes from repetition. I had been the one renewing leases, updating registrations, handling digital certificates that expired if no one paid attention. Years earlier, when the company was smaller and cash was tight, I put my own name on a few things to speed approvals. Temporary, they said. We'll fix it later. Later never came. Growth has a way of making people forget foundations. I pulled the files and confirmed what I already knew. The core assets weren't just linked to me. They depended on me. By noon, the first crack appeared. An operations manager called, voice tight, asking why a vendor portal suddenly required my authorization. I told him I was reviewing compliance. That word shuts people up. 15 minutes later, a bank representative emailed, politely requesting confirmation for routine transfers. I replied that all disbursements were paused pending review. Routine is a comforting word until it stops being true. I could feel the building tense without hearing a single raised voice. They tried charm next. My sister showed up in person, smiling too hard, perfume announcing her before she spoke. She talked about misunderstanding, about stress, about how families fight and make up. She suggested coffee. I suggested she put everything in writing. Her smile flickered. Writing turns performances into evidence. She left without finishing her sentence, heels clicking like punctuation marks she couldn't control. By late afternoon, my uncle called a meeting I didn't attend. I watched the calendar update in real time, invites bouncing, rooms changing, urgency escalating. They were discovering how much of their momentum ran through approvals they couldn't access. Power outages don't start with explosions. They start with switches that refuse to flip. I stayed still, letting the quiet do its work. When evening came, I left the building with the same calm I'd felt the night before. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the slow recalibration happening behind glass and concrete. I didn't feel vindictive. I felt precise. Every step I took was backed by documentation, by dates and signatures that told a story no one else had bothered to read. That was the advantage. I didn't need to threaten. The structure itself was speaking. At home, in a borrowed room with borrowed furniture, I opened a folder I had labeled years earlier and never touched again. Contingencies. Inside were drafts of notices, transitions, and safeguards I had prepared when my father's health first declined. I updated the dates, checked the statutes, and sent a single certified letter. Not to them, but to the board. Facts only. No emotion, just clarity. They would call it betrayal. They always do when accountability arrives without warning. But betrayal requires loyalty that was honored, and mine had been treated like a utility, useful until inconvenient. As I sealed the envelope, I understood something important. Being thrown out didn't make me reckless. It made me exact. And exactness, applied patiently, is far more dangerous than anger. The fallout didn't arrive with sirens or shouting. It came in pauses, missed calls, meetings that ended early. By the second day, rumors were circulating through the office faster than facts. People sensed instability the way animals sense a storm. Systems that had always worked suddenly required confirmations no one could give. Payments delayed. Contracts flagged. All perfectly legal, all traceable back to my name, sitting quietly where it had always been. They finally asked to meet. Not ordered. Asked. That distinction mattered more than they realized. We sat across from each other in a conference room that used to make me feel small. Now it felt neutral, like any other room. My uncle talked first, carefully, about unity and shared history. My sister stared at the table, jaw tight, already rehearsing her version of events for later. I listened until he ran out of words, then slid a folder across the table. Inside was nothing dramatic. No accusations, just copies of filings, agreements, renewals, and clauses highlighted in soft yellow. Evidence without commentary, ownership without boasting. The room went very quiet as they flipped through pages they recognized but had never read. That's the thing about assuming control. You stop checking the details that actually hold it together. "You can't do this," my sister said finally, her voice thin. I didn't argue, I didn't need to. The law doesn't respond to disbelief. I told them what would happen next, calmly, step by step. Transitional oversight, independent audit, temporary management adjustments, not revenge, resolution. They heard punishment because that's what it felt like to lose something they thought was theirs by default. They asked what I wanted. That question used to terrify me. It doesn't anymore. I told them the truth. I wanted transparency, accountability, and distance. I didn't want their house or their approval. I wanted the structure fixed so no one else would be treated the way I had been, useful until disposable. Wanting less than they expected unsettled them more than any demand could have. Within a week, the narrative shifted. They told people I was difficult, emotional, unstable. It didn't stick. Paper trails don't care about tone. Vendors adjusted. Partners adapted. The board backed the changes because stability is more convincing than outrage. Slowly, almost anticlimactically, the empire they thought they owned adjusted to its actual foundation. I moved on with my life without the dramatic closure movies promise. No apology arrived that mattered. No speech changed hearts. What changed was leverage. I no longer lived inside their version of me. I built something quieter, cleaner, and fully mine, using the same skills they had dismissed for years. Organization, patience, attention to detail, the things that never look powerful until they are. Sometimes people ask how it felt to be thrown out and end up owning everything. I tell them the truth. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like finally standing on solid ground after years of being told the floor could disappear at any moment. They thought trash was something you throw away. They never considered what happens when the thing you discard turns out to be the structure holding everything together. The last time I saw my sister, she looked tired. Smaller. She didn't apologize. She didn't need to. We both knew what had happened. Power had shifted, not with noise, but with clarity. I walked away without looking back, not because I was afraid of turning into them, but because I didn't need the view anymore. Being thrown out was supposed to end me. Instead, it ended their illusion. And that was the biggest mistake they ever made.